Nadia Selle had 11 hours and roughly 300,000 people who needed to not be on this planet anymore. She stood on the rise above Drevath Cove with a headset jammed to one ear and a tablet in her other hand, watching the beach below fill with bodies. Slate blue families, the Drevathi moved in kinship clusters, always, grandparents and children and working-age adults all pressed together, were pouring out of the bluff road in waves. The convoy from the inland districts had collapsed 2 hours ago when the Conclave bombardment strayed 2 kilometers off its declared corridor and took out the central interchange. Now, every surviving ground route funneled through the cove, and the cove had been designed to handle a fishing fleet, not an exodus. Behind her, the sky glowed orange in a long smear above the Saret Valley. The secondary population center was burning. That was 40,000 people she couldn't reach yet. Selle, the voice in her ear was Dmitry Orlov, captain of the EAS Perseverance, currently holding station 12 kilometers offshore. We've got 6 more in the convoy. 2 container haulers, 3 atmospheric freighters, 1 medical tender. They want routing. Send the freighters to Zone B, the containers to Zone C, Nadia said without looking up from the tablet. Tell the medical tender to anchor at the zone a breakwater. That's where the crush injuries will come out first. She paused. How many do we have total now? 41 hulls offshore, Orlov said. We'll have 47 by the time the last 2 clear the outer marker. 47 ships. 6 hours ago the manifest had listed 11, and those had been Earth Aid Corps vessels, the ones her organization had actually dispatched. The rest had come in on their own. Civilian merchant captains who had picked up the distress relay, a pair of research vessels that had rerouted from a survey contract in the outer belt, a retired transport operator who had apparently just turned his ship around without filing a flight plan. Nadia had stopped being surprised around hour 3. She hadn't stopped being grateful. The Drevathi Planetary Authority had filed their emergency appeal with the Conclave Protectorate 32 hours ago. The Conclave had responded with procedural acknowledgement in 11 hours, which was, she'd been told, unusually fast. They were deliberating. The deliberation was ongoing. There was no timeline. The Conclave had standing response protocols for member worlds under duress, and the Drevathi were associate members, not full members, which meant the protocols involved a review committee, and the review committee had a quorum requirement, and 2 of its voting members were currently unreachable. Earth had no formal relationship with the Drevathi at all. Nadia had gotten the signal on the Earth Aid Corps emergency relay, which she monitored because it was her job. She had been in orbit around a completely different planet doing a post-disaster assessment. She had filed a reroute request and started making calls while her shuttle was still docking with the Perseverance. By the time she reached the cove, the Corps had committed 4 additional ships, and the civilian calls were already coming in. Selle, a different voice now, Warrant Officer Keiko Tan, running the Marine detachment on the beach, 12 Marines. That was the entirety of the armed component of this operation, because Earth Aid Corps didn't normally bring guns. Zone C is backing up. I've got 2,000 people in the queue, and the loading ramp on Container 3 is jammed. Get someone on that ramp. My best mechanic is already on it. A pause. She's 11 years old. I mean that in the best way. Nadia almost smiled. Petty Officer Ewa Marsh, the youngest person on the Perseverance's maintenance rotation, had apparently decided that the Zone C ramp problem was her personal responsibility. Tell Marsh she gets a commendation if she gets that ramp in 4 minutes. I'll tell her she gets bragging rights. She doesn't care about commendations. The ramp was open in 3. From the rise, Nadia could see the 3 loading zones stretching along the cove. Zone A was the shallow water operation, smaller craft, difficult extraction, primarily for the elderly and injured who couldn't handle a boarding ramp. Zone B was the main lift, the freighters taking on families in batches of 400, their container bays hastily divided with cargo netting and emergency padding. Zone C was the one with the ramp problem and the container haulers and 2,000 people in an increasingly uncomfortable queue, and now apparently it was fine. She turned back to the valley. The orange smear had spread. "Orlov," she said, "I need someone to go into Saret." A brief silence. "That's 40 kilometers under bombardment corridor." The declared corridor ends at the Saret perimeter. The straying earlier was anomalous. She heard herself say it with more confidence than she felt. 40,000 people inland. I need a ship small enough to navigate the Saret Canal approach and big enough to take on a meaningful load. "That's a volunteer ask." "Yes." Another silence. Then, "Captain Bremler of the Anastasia is already hailing me. She says she knows the Saret Canal approach, and she's volunteering." Nadia found the Anastasia on her tablet, a mid-hull grain transport, retired commercial registry, privately operated. Bremler wasn't part of the Corps. She'd shown up 4 hours ago and just started taking on families from Zone A without being asked. "Clear her," Nadia said. "Tell her I want a channel." When Bremler came on, she sounded about 60 and entirely unbothered. "Selle, I've got the canal approach on my nav. Wind's shifting south, which is good. I can make the Saret inner key in under 2 hours if the access locks haven't been hit." "What's your capacity?" "Grain hold stripped down. I can take on 1,100 in reasonable conditions. More if they're compressed." "They'll be compressed," Nadia said. "Bremler, the bombardment corridor." "I've dodged worse." A pause. "Anyway, someone has to go." That was the thing about this operation that Nadia kept finding she had no adequate framework for. Someone had to go, and there was always someone who went. Not because they'd been ordered, not because it was their job, because there were 40,000 people in a burning city and someone had to go, so someone did. The conclave, she'd heard, was still deliberating. She tracked the Anastasia's departure from her tablet and turned her attention back to the beach. Zone B was loading smoothly now. The freighters, running a continuous cycle, arrive at the ramp, take on 400, move offshore to the staging area, shuttle the load to the larger container haulers standing a few kilometers out, return empty for another run. It was a decent system. It hadn't been a system 2 hours ago. It had been chaos with good intentions. The shape of it had emerged through iteration and argument, and Keiko Tan, walking a freighter captain, through a two-way traffic pattern that the captain had initially described as impossible. It wasn't impossible. It just required everyone to trust everyone else's timing, and humans, Nadia had found, were unusually good at that under pressure. On the beach, a cluster of Drevathi elders had stopped moving. They stood apart from the flow of families, in a semicircle with their heads bowed and their secondary limbs. The Drevathi had 4 arms. The upper pair was for work, the lower for expression and prayer, raised in the held position that she'd been told was a supplication gesture. The Drevathi who prayed held their lower arms like that. She'd seen it twice already today, small pockets of them stopping in the middle of evacuation to pray. She had not asked who they were praying to. "Zone B coordinator," she said into the headset. "There's a group of stationary elders at the south end of the queue. Can someone walk them forward, gently?" "Already on it," said Corporal Raid, who was 19 and had been on his first off-world deployment for 6 days. He crossed the beach in a steady walk, not running, which was the right call. Running spooked people. Nadia watched him reach the elders, stop, and say something she couldn't hear. One of the elders raised her head and looked at him. He made a gesture toward the loading ramp. After a moment, the elder nodded, and the group began to move. The Drevathi didn't have a word for Earth Aid Corps, Nadia knew. They barely had a framework for Earth. The Drevathi had been in the Conclave sphere for 80 years. Their entire orientation was toward the Conclave's member species. The emergency relay that had pulled her in had been a planetary broadcast, not a directed signal, not asking Earth specifically, because the Drevathi would not have thought to ask Earth specifically. They had called out to anyone who could hear. Earth heard. By hour 7, Nadia had 114,000 people loaded and offshore, and the pace had settled into something she could almost call efficient. The ramp systems were running. The freighter rotation was holding. Petty Officer Marsh had moved on from the Zone C ramp to 3 other mechanical problems she'd apparently decided were her personal responsibility. Keiko Tan had organized a group of young adult Drevathi, those strong enough to carry, into a voluntary loading assist team, and they were moving elders and children up the ramps faster than the ramp crews alone could have managed. The channel from the Anastasia came in at hour 8. Bremler's voice was steady but had an edge to it. Saret Inner Key. I've got a crowd here I wasn't expecting. The canal approach was intact but the key is packed. There's no organization on this end. I need a ground coordinator. Nadia looked at her available personnel. She had 4 core staffers who weren't currently essential. She had herself. I'm coming, she said. Selle, Orlov started. I'll need a fast shuttle to the Saret Canal mouth, 20 minutes each way. She was already moving down the rise toward the beach. Keiko runs Zone A and B in my absence. The rotation holds. She got to Saret in 17 minutes, transferred to a small rigid-hull craft that Bremler had sent to the canal mouth, and arrived at the Inner Key to find approximately 8,000 people trying to board a ship designed for 1,100. Not in panic, that was the thing. The Drevathi at the key were not panicking. They were pressing, close and silent, in the way of people who have decided that the only thing to do is endure. Children were held up above the crowd. The elderly were in the center of family clusters, protected. Nadia climbed up to the key bollard, which put her a meter above the crowd, and opened her field amplifier. We have room for everyone, she said, and waited while it translated. We are not leaving without everyone. We need to board in family groups, grandparents and children first, then the rest. I need 6 family groups to step forward now. The crowd shifted. It didn't rush, it organized. She had no adequate explanation for why it worked as fast as it did, except that people who have been waiting for someone to tell them what to do will do almost anything once someone tells them. She directed boarding for 40 minutes, and Bremler ran 3 loads, partial loads, the ship shuttling out to the staging area and back, filling by increments. By the 3rd load the key was down to a manageable crowd, and a Drevathi dockworker with a municipal amplifier had taken over the spacing, and was doing it better than Nadia had. She led him. The bombardment corridor shifted once while she was in Saret, and the shift put it 3 kilometers closer to the key than the declared perimeter. She didn't tell the crowd. She told Bremler, and Bremler accelerated the loading cycle. They got out. All of them. Nadia was back at the cove by hour 10, and the cove was nearly empty. 47 ships. The last families were coming down the bluff road in a straggling line, old people and young people, and a few Drevathi who had apparently spent the past 2 hours helping load before getting in line themselves. Corporal Raid was at the bottom of the ramp, still not running, still steady, waving people forward with the same patient gesture he'd been using for 8 hours. The beach was mud and footprints and the empty wrappers of core emergency ration packs someone had distributed at some point. No bodies. Nadia had been watching for that, and there were none. Hour 11. The last hull of the civilian convoy crossed the outer marker. Nadia stood on the rise for a moment before boarding the shuttle back to the Perseverance. A Drevathi woman stood near her, one of the municipal workers who'd stayed to the end, helping with the final loading. She was young, maybe 20 years old in human terms, with the deep blue-gray coloration of the coastal Drevathi and the lower arms that were too tired now to make any gesture at all. She looked at Nadia and said something. The translator took a moment. When it came through, it said, "We sent our signal to the Conclave. You were not the ones we called." Nadia looked at her, I know. The Drevathi woman held her gaze. The lower arms lifted slowly into the held position, the prayer posture, or what served it. Then she turned and walked down toward the last shuttle. Nadia didn't move for a moment. The orange smear above Saret Valley had gone dark. The fires there were out. She knew because Bremler had confirmed it 40 minutes ago. 312,000 people cleared and offshore. 47 ships. 43 of them hadn't been asked. She thought about the Conclave's review committee, its quorum requirement, its unreachable voting members. She thought about Captain Bremler, who was 60 years old and had turned her grain hauler around and just gone. The review committee's deliberation, she'd been told, was still ongoing at the time the last ship cleared the marker. By then it didn't matter. The Drevathi Planetary Relay had been broadcasting the convoy's IFF signatures in real time for 11 hours. Across every frequency, the outer sector could hear. The galaxy had been watching the whole time. It just hadn't been the one doing the work. Nadia picked up her tablet and started filing the after-action report. There were hull logs to pull, personnel commendations to write, and 47 captains who were going to need someone to talk to about what they'd just done. She started with Bremler.